Today on Rick's Woodworking Shop, we're gonna make this side table for the back patio. It's made from leftover parts from other projects, stained and ready for our cocktail. Our table is going to be 20 inches tall and 16 inches wide. And it'll be 16 by 16. We're gonna build it out of scrap wood that's here in the workshop. So rather than do rails and stiles and mortise everything in to make a panel, we're actually going to build the plywood box first. Material is called T111. This was left over from a project. And what we want to do is we want to make this look like a panel inside a frame. So we're going to take a reference point from the center and out. Our final dimension is going to be 16 inches. When we look at everything cut up, we get down to about 14.5, which is what we need to cut these panels to. So I'm going to lay that out, set up the table saw, and go ahead and cut that strip. Found our center line, and drew out 15.25, because that's the dimensions of the box at final size. And then I took 3/4 of an inch off, because that's the thickness of this plywood. And when we assemble it, that 3/4 of an inch will come into play. So we'll set up our table saw, we'll rip down our piece, and then we'll cross cut it for height, and we'll start doing some assembly. We've adjusted our rib fence again, because now we're going to cut these to height. We're going to put a top and a bottom on 3/4 and then wrap it. So we ended up with a dimension of 16.5 inches. With the saw set, let's cut these out. Now we're ready to do some assembly. I've temporarily clamped the piece so I can show you why we cut one side a little differently. This way we get this full piece and this full thickness, which matches. That way the pattern will be consistent around all 4 sides. Because this project is going to live outside, we're using some waterproof glue. And even though the screws should be more than enough to hold it together, I like adding that additional bit of fastening. I'm just using the other panel to hold this one in place and just having gravity help me out. Now that our box is assembled, we're going to take some measurements to cut out the tops. And I'm reading 15.25. Actually 15.1/8 on this side. 15.1/8. The top is square, but our box may not be. So once I get 2 sides set up, everything should be good to go. As we can see, it's not very square. Now, this is going to go outside. And you might ask, why'd you put a top and a bottom if it's just going to be a table? Well, I don't want critters living in here, so I wanted to make sure it was all nice and sealed up. Now, even though it's going to go outside, this T111 is rather rough. So what I think I'm going to do next is get out my sander, sand this smooth, and then get it ready for stain. And then when we come back, we'll mill up the pieces that will trim this out. After milling our boards to 2 inches, I looked at the overall design and decided that that really wasn't the thickness that this entire project needed. So I went out to the home center and picked up some wider, thicker boards. With our stop set at 20 inches, we're going to cut the legs. We're going to need 8 pieces. Our leg's going to be L-shaped. But if we left the pieces full width, we'd have one side of the L longer than the other. So let's trim down these guys so that we make a perfect square. Since we're going to be cutting off a piece from each of these boards, it's a great time to get rid of imperfections like knots. It's time for some assembly. Got our pre-cut pieces. This is a rough side and a smooth side. I'm going to put the smooth side down. Why? Because the smooth side will glue better against the other pieces, and this will fix better to the actual box. And then later we can just sand these pieces smooth. Some glue and some pins. Always spread your glue out. My handy brush here. And this is weatherproof glue. So we shouldn't have any problems with pieces coming apart because of moisture. I put a generous amount of glue in here and along the side here. The old saying is true. You can never have enough clamps. We let the glue set overnight, and now it's time to start working on the rails. Our piece is 11 13/16. So we'll measure that out. With our pieces rough cut to length, we're going to go ahead and test fit them, see if they fit all right, but they need some trimming. Just going to use my hammer, a little block, to make sure I don't mar the wood. Now that's pretty snug, but that's a good thing. We'll lay some glue in, we'll test fit this one, and then, like before, we'll nail it off. Glue set up overnight. Took it out of the clamps. You can see we have a nice piece, but it's not quite finished. We want to do a little bit more. So we're going to use this. We're going to use a little bit of a quarter round molding. We're going to miter it, and then we're going to put it in place. So let me show you how we make this quarter round molding. The process starts by using some stock, same thickness as the sides. And what we're going to do is we're going to cut it to length. The longest piece we have is 13 inches, so I've marked 2 lines at 13 inches. I'll cut them on the power miter box, and then we'll go to the router. We set up a quarter round on our router and our fence to keep the pieces in place. Now we'll go to the bandsaw and cut out our quarters. We have our blades set so that we're just cutting the very edge here. And then once we have this cut out, we'll flip it and cut it down the middle. And now we have the quarter rounds. With all our quarter round cut, I went ahead and mitered some of the pieces so we can start assembly. All we're doing is just put in a few pins to hold it in place. Then we'll take the next piece. I've already mitered 1/2 of it. Measure it. And now these pieces are so small that I don't want to cut them on the table saw or on the chop saw. So I'm using the bandsaw to cut these out. Once I had it measured with the pencil, rough, I had to go through a few times to get it just right. You'll see it fits nice and snug in there. Even though the top's going to get covered with a piece of wood, we wanted to sand it to make sure that things were level and we didn't have any peaks so that the glue could adhere really well. Now we'll change the sandpaper on the sander down to 100 and then 150 and do the sides. And then we'll come back through by hand and knock down all these corners and sand the quarter rounds. I'm just going to use this stick to spread everything around. Piece of solid pine, glued together. Actually came out of some IKEA furniture. And what we'll do now is we'll set up these pieces of wood to hold it all down. Once I secured the first set of clamps, I decided to turn the piece over so that I could add a few more, and it made it just a little bit easier to handle. We took our piece out of the clamps, and you can see it's looking really good. So what we're going to do now is use a router with a flush trim bit to trim this little overhang away. Gone over it with 100 grit sandpaper on the orbital sander. Now we're going to do it by hand to make sure that we get the grain marks nice and we don't get any scratch marks from the sander. And then we can also smooth out these little edges. So we're nearly at the point where we can start staining. But before I do, I want to clean off the surface one more time, this time with some mineral spirits. It's going to do two things. One, it'll absorb any last little bit of dust. Even though with the stain we're going to be using, the dust isn't that important. But more importantly here, it will show us if there's any scratches on the surface. Like if our sander gouged a small spot or we have swirls. We don't really like those, they stand up too much. So the mineral spirits will show that off. Now I can see a little bit of one right here. It's gonna be really hard for you to see it on camera, but I can see it right there. So I'm gonna come back through and give it a little bit of sanding, probably with 100 grit and then 150. Piece is prepped. We flipped it over because we wanna seal the bottom. We're gonna use a red chestnut stain. Using a disposable brush, I'm gonna start hitting the center here and then working the inside of the legs. You should always start with the surface that's furthest from you. That way there's less likely a chance, oh, that's really good English. There's less of a chance that you'll get dirty with your own work, be that paint or stain. So now that I've gotten those pieces inside nice and coated, I'm going to start working on the surfaces. Now that the stain is all on, I can actually see some squirrel marks on top of there. So we're going to take out our sandpaper. We're going to clean that up before the stain dries. You'll notice I've masked off the rest of the piece, and I'm just going to do a light set of coats on the top. And here you have it, our side table. Polyurethane is dried, and we have a solid surface to put just about anything on. Join us next time and see what else we'll build in Rick's woodworking shop.